I actually see the notes from that Capablanca wrote at the time, and this gives me a good chuckle. It says, "I do not consider the system adopted by Dr. Lasker in this game to be any good." Toxic much? To give some background, Emmanuel Lasker was the world champion from, I believe, 1897 or around there, or maybe it was a few years. I think it was 1895 until 1921. He was a world champion for 27 years. And I would say Lasker was very clearly the best player in the world up until probably the 1910s or around thereabout. And at that point, there were two players who started to rise very quickly. And there was Akiba Rubinstein and José Raúl Capablanca. Now, prior to the outbreak of World War I, Rubinstein tried to come up with funds to have a match against Lasker, and they had actually agreed to terms to play a world championship match, I believe in 1912, but with sort of the outbreak of the World War and everything that happened, the match did not occur. And after World War I, I believe that Rubinstein simply did not have the funds. Again, to put that in perspective, in the old days, the way the world championship match worked was that if you were a contender and you wanted to play the world champion, you had to find sponsors. You had to come up with the money to challenge the world champion. So Rubinstein tried, but he was unable to. And then I believe it was around like 1918 or 1919. There was the possibility of Capablanca challenging him. Fortunately for Capablanca, he was able to come up with sponsors, and they did play the world championship match in 1921 in Havana. So the match was actually very clean for Capablanca. He won this match by a score of 9-5, 4 wins, and I believe 10 draws, if I'm not mistaken, to become the world champion. I think that this was not the last game of the match, but this is the last game that Capablanca won, the fourth victory of his. And this game also shows a good understanding, sort of tactical motives, but also positional themes as well. So all right, let's go with the game. So d4 played here. So d5 played by Lasker. Capablanca goes knight f3, e6, c4. Again, in the old days, by the way, to be clear, before all the theory had been hashed out on the Queen's Gambit accepted, most people did play knight to f3 and not pawn to c4 on move 2. So in the old days, this was considered generally a little bit safer because no one was really 100% sure what was going on in this Queen's Gambit accepted. So knight f3 is played, pawn to e6, now c4 played by Capablanca, knight f6, bishop g5, knight bd7. And much like one of the games I showed yesterday that Lasker played against Pillsbury from Hastings, you see the Queen's Gambit decline defense being featured very heavily again. And this was the primary defense of Emmanuel Lasker during the period when he was the world champion. So pawn to e3, bishop e7, knight c3, castles, rook c1. Now, again, if you show this game to someone now, you don't mention who played it, you'd be like, okay, pretty standard theory, modern day theory, looks very normal so far. Which shows how strong these players were, that a lot of these ideas and a lot of the development that they played, it exists in modern day chess. So rook to e8 is played here. Now this is probably the first dubious move, I would say. Nowadays we understand that in the Queen's Gambit decline, you generally have to play like pawn to c5, or you have to play pawn to h6, things of this sort of nature. So rook to e8 is played here. Queen to c2 played by Capablanca. c6 by Lasker, bishop to d3 here played by Capablanca. Again, very standard, very nice moves. And what we've learned again in modern day theory in the Queen's Gambit decline is generally you have to be more active playing pawn to c5 with the bishop being on g5 here. So pawn takes c4, bishop takes c4, knight to d5 played here by Lasker. Okay, so Capablanca trades, castles, knight to f8. Now this move is not the best move, certainly. It's probably a move that I would say is highly dubious here in terms of how when you're trying to play this system. But that being said, Black is struggling because when you play the Queen's Gambit declined, especially in lines where you try to trade the dark square bishops, you're always looking for breaks with e5 or c5 here, and Black doesn't really have that option, because if you push either pawn, you just end up losing a pawn on d5. And if you additionally take on c3 and I take, you can't push e5 because I'm controlling it with 1, 2, 3, and you have 1, 2. And if you push c5 here, I think after rook to d1, white is very far ahead in development. You have two pieces, this bishop on c8, there's rook on a8, that are not really in the game here. So that is very important. So knight f8 is played here by Lasker. So now Capablanca plays rook fd1, Lasker goes bishop to d7, and now by the way, since I did take a PGN of this game, Capablanca wrote at the time, and this gives me a good chuckle. It says, I do not consider the system adopted by Dr. Lasker in this game to be any good. Toxic much? Anyway, so bishop d7 obviously played by Lasker here. So now pawn to e4 played by Capablanca. I mean, I guess he called him doctor, to be fair, but still, yeah, I do not consider the system to be any good. Pretty funny. All right, so pawn to e4 played by Capablanca. Very good move, by the way. Again, Lasker sort of, what he's doing here is he's being a little bit too passive. Now after rook d1, you're never getting any breaks, so white has a lot more space in this position. So bishop to d7 played by Lasker. Pawn to e4 played by Capablanca. Lasker goes knight to b6. So now Capablanca plays bishop f1, and what you see here is a situation where white has a good grip on the center, good control with the pawns, much more space. You see like this bishop and this knight. This bishop doesn't really have any scope because there are two pawns in front of it. This knight additionally is not really contesting anything. It stops any like checkmating patterns, but it's not really doing a whole lot here. So rook to c8 is played by Lasker. Pawn to b4 by Capablanca. A great move. What this does, further restricting black's space here. Black would love to go c5 and create more space. As I've said several times, generally speaking, when you end up in a position where you have a lot less space, like here where white has good control of the center, you're looking for two things. You're looking for either piece trades, so you would love to trade some knights or trade some bishops, because less pieces means that the side having more space, it's very hard to take advantage of having more space when you don't have that many forces on the board. And then secondly, if you can't do that, you're looking for pawn breaks or ways to contest the center or make trades. Now the ways that, when I say like pawn trades, what you're looking for is you're looking for either c5, e5, or pawn to f5. There are three kind of moves here that you're looking for. Now e5 is not playable because the pawn, I would just capture the pawn or the knight. I have two things guarding it. If you play f5, it's a move, but the thing that you're conceding, let me just make a white move so I can make a black move, is if you play f5 here, I can go knight to e5, and now I've got this really nice outpost. So on the one hand, you're breaking up this big center, but on the other hand, now I have this really dominant knight on this outpost at e5 square. So that's why Capablanca plays b4 here to prevent it. So once you decide e5, f5 aren't playable, c5 is the only break, and b4 just restricts it. And now it's a very unpleasant task for Lasker here to try and salvage this game, because again, there's just no space here. So now bishop to e8. Bishop to e8 is played by Lasker. Capablanca plays queen to b3. Nice improving move. Again, you maybe want to play d5, maybe you want to play b5, maybe you want to go a4, a5, but it's just a very classy move to sort of get the queen off this open, this sort of the c file, and threaten to maybe play b5 or d5 here. So now rook e to c7 is played by Lasker. Capablanca plays pawn to a4 here. And again, the idea behind rook c7 by Lasker is that he wants to be able to, if you push either of these pawns, like let's say you go b5, I take, and now the rooks are stacked on an open file, and same thing with d5. The rooks are stacked on the open line. So Lasker is basically trying to prevent Capablanca from pushing either b5 or pawn to d5. Those are the two moves that he's worried about. At the same time, Capablanca doesn't have to really worry about that, because black has no way of forcing open the position. There are really no pawn breaks here. So here, a4 is played by Capablanca. Lasker goes knight to g6. Capablanca plays a5, very logical move. Knight to d7, and now here Capablanca makes a very committal move, but a move that is absolutely 100% the best move. And again, as I was highlighting in the other game, a lot of people try to say that modern day players are better than the world champions of the past, but you will see that once you get out of the opening, a lot of these themes, a lot of the understanding, even when you compare it with computers, these players were finding the best moves. And here, the best move in the position is pawn to e5, and it's a very committal move because your idea is to put the knight on d6 where it's a big outpost, but at the same time, when you push this pawn, black knight can now jump to this outpost on d5 because the pawn no longer covers the square. So both sides get outposts, but as we see, both even from my general knowledge, but also in looking at the computer evaluation, it is 100% the right move, I believe. Let's see. Or Yeah, I mean, you can also play there also are other themes, like you can play G3 here to restrict the knight from this F4 square, which is also really delicious. But I do really like E5. Let's see it think for 1 minute and see if it still says E5 is best or if it says something else, because I think it's going to say E5 is the best move. So as you see, this is the thing that I will reiterate again, is that if these players, the world champions, I think probably from Capablanca onward specifically, were able to just play a middle game, just a slightly imbalanced position against players today, I think you could very easily say they would be like 2550 to 2600 for sure, because their understanding was really good. Why is queen b2 strong? I honestly don't know. I have no idea. So yeah, so as we see, e5, it is listed as the best move at depth 27. So it just shows how strong these players really were. So e5, what it was on there at 27, but anyway, e5. Okay, so Lasker goes b6. Again, black is really struggling here because what you see is white wants to put the knight on d6 with an outpost. Additionally, black still has no pawn breaks. If you go f6, this pawn on e6 is very weak. So you can't try to pawn break with f6. You can't pawn break here because I've got such a grip on the dark squares. So Lasker plays pawn to b6, trying to force open the C file where the rooks are stacked. It makes sense, obviously. You put the rooks on the C file, you've got to try to do something here because you have no space whatsoever. So knight to e4 played by Capablanca. Lasker plays rook to b8. Also, I really like this move because additionally, it's not trading down here. It's really important to keep in mind, like, do you want to trade the pawns here or do you just want to play knight e4? And in this case, knight e4 is a much better move because what happens is, if you trade down too many pawns, for example, like I'm just going to make a random move, you get to some position like this, ignoring the evaluation for a second, this is more conceptual. What you see is that it's 4 pawns for each side. So with 4 pawns for each side, even though black has less space, black always has good chances to at least draw the game because there's so much less space here. So that's why Capablanca correctly plays knight to e4, because you'll notice now if black does this and tries to go c5, there always are a pawns on the board, so you don't end up in a situation where it's just like 4 pawns for each side and there are very good drawing chances. So Capablanca plays knight to e4. Rook to b8 is played by Lasker. Capablanca plays queen to c3. Again, very good move, dodges any threats on the b file. Additionally, there's no c5. Like if you push c5, I can probably just take, and I mean I can take with the knight even, or take with the pawn. It's very strong. Also, the queen guards the e5 pawn additionally, so black will never be able to capture it with either of the knights. So here, queen c3, knight to f4 is played. So now Capablanca plays knight to d6. Lasker goes knight to d5. Capablanca plays queen to a3. So you'll see, again, black has gotten his knight to this outpost square on d5, which is why that whole e5 push was so committal. That being said, it is still quite a bit better for white. So now Lasker plays f6, again, trying to undermine this knight. Let's just say I play a random move like h3. There always are tricks like pawn takes pawn, and now I can take the pawn, which supports the knight, because when you take the knight, I can take your knight. And additionally, if you take my bishop, I can just take the knight with check first, and after queen f3, queen e8, black is actually up a pawn here. Now the fact that the computer thinks white is still better despite being down a pawn sort of speaks volumes to how weak black's position is. So black tries to undermine these 2 pawns which support the knight on the outpost at d6 square. So here Capablanca now plays another very committal move, a move that I personally don't like. I think it's a move that I think it's a little bit hasty, and it really kind of from a fundamental standpoint doesn't jive, which is he plays knight takes e8. Now the funny thing is, I said that, but as you guys can see from the bar, the computer says knight takes e8 is the best move, which again, it shows it does show how strong Capablanca was. So Capablanca trades, takes, and again, remember you guys, this is not a modern day game. This is a game from 1921. Capablanca was stockfish version 0.1. Yeah. So queen takes pawn. So now here Lasker takes with the pawn. Now this is definitely not the right move here. It creates a lot of weaknesses around the black king. It's understandable why you take with the pawn, but ultimately I think it would have been better to take with the knight so that you have an outpost. Your knights guard each other. Additionally, you can always try to play like queen e7 and queen b4, and while white is better, I think I like it a little bit more. Instead, G takes f6 is played. Pawn to b5 played by Capablanca. Here, the idea being that now what Capablanca is trying to do is the whole position has changed. Now he no longer has an outposted knight, so what he's looking to do is get to a position, get to like sort of a complicated position where he's going to be able to put a lot of pressure on the center of the board. Like, let's just say black moves the knight, you can take, and now the knight is under attack, like rook d8 here, and now you can go rook to e1, and there's just too much pressure here towards these knights and the pawn on e6. So Capablanca shifts, and this also is, I think, a sign of just how good he was, that he was able to shift completely from one concept where he's playing a very positional game to sort of playing much more tactical here in this late middle game. So Rook C8 is played by Lasker. Logical move again, trying to exchange pawns and exchange rooks. And what you'll notice here is black's king is weak, but you'll notice that there are less pieces on the board than there were earlier. So even though it's bad, there are more chances to survive. So pawn takes, rook takes, trade, bishop, pawn takes, pawn takes. Of course you take with the pawn, not the rook or the knights, because then white will just take a7. So rook to e1 is played here by Capablanca. So now Lasker goes queen to c8, and now Capablanca plays knight to d2. Again, very nice move from a fundamental standpoint, because you'll notice this pawn, it sort of dominates the knight. The knight can't really jump anywhere. So the knight looks nice on f3, but without any ways to attack towards the black king, you sometimes want to look to reroute it to a better square. So he goes knight to d2 here, with the idea of putting it on a better square, whether it's c4 or e4. It's going to have much more scope. Thank you to Chesscom TR for the host with 321 viewers. Thank you so much to everybody from Turkey. Hope you guys are having a great evening, I guess, in Istanbul or wherever you are in the country. We are going over some World Championship games right now. We're currently looking at the game between José Araul, Capablanca, and Emmanuel Lasker. So knight d2 is played, knight to f8 by Lasker. Capablanca puts the knight on e4. Very logical square again. If black pushes, now the knight can go to g5 or potentially even reroute itself to f3 and e5 here. But you see here it's putting pressure on the pawn. If we go back to this position, you're not putting pressure on the pawn, so black never has to do anything, and the pawn just prevents the knight from going anywhere. But once you reach this position, the knight puts pressure on the pawn. If you push, it gets access to the squares that it wanted before, but it's just placed much more accurately. Okay, so knight e4, queen to d8 is played here by Lasker. So now Capablanca plays pawn to h4. Now this is this might be, it's an interesting move. I don't know if I love it, but I think it makes sense. Again, also to be fair, speaking of Stockfish or Alpha Zero, we have the infamous pawn to h4 played by Capablanca as well. And I know most people pretty consistently talk about, why do computers always push the stupid h pawn or the stupid a pawn? So h4 is an interesting move. I don't know if it's the best move, but I do like it conceptually. In terms of, like, the idea is that Capablanca is hoping for f5 so that he can go knight g5. The pawn now supports the knight. Additionally, I think he also wants to go g3 maybe, and put a bishop on h3. And the third part is that in an endgame, maybe this pawn can go to h5 or h6 and restrict the knight on f8. So now rook to c7 is played here by Lasker. And now queen to b3 played by Capablanca. Very logical move. The idea being that he wants to play bishop to c4, put pressure on the knight on d5, because the knight holds the pawn on f6 here. If you get the bishop to c4, then black's gonna have a lot of problems with his pawn on f6. So now rook g7 played by Lasker. Pawn to g3 played by Capablanca. Again, a very nice move here. Puts the pawns on dark squares where they protect each other. Additionally, what happens is that on top of putting pawns on this dark square diagonal, it creates scope for bishop h3, where you can put pressure on e6 or bishop c4. And the third part is that also it stops the knight from coming to f4 long term. So rook to a7 is played here, bishop to c4 by Capablanca, now putting maximum pressure on this knight on d5, and by virtue of that, pressure on the pawn on f6. So now rook to a5 played by Lasker, knight to c3 by Capablanca. Again, a move to try and get rid of this knight, because one thing that happens here is this transformation with knights off the board now is that black has a terrible knight on f8. It's passive. It's tied down to this pawn forever. It's never going to be an active piece, where this bishop has all kinds of threats on all different diagonals. And third part is that white has ideas like rook b1, rook e6, queen f3, and white is probably technically winning here. So now king to f7 is played by Lasker. Capablanca goes queen to e3, puts pressure on the pawn on e6 with the queen, the bishop, and the rook. Additionally, maybe queen h6 ideas are lurking here as well to put pressure towards h7. Queen d6 played by Lasker. Capablanca plays queen to e4. Another improving move, pressure h7, threaten queen b7, all the while keeping pressure on the pawn on e6. So now rook to a4 is played by Lasker. So Capablanca plays queen to b7. Lasker goes king g6. Now again, this is kind of forced here. If you go queen e7, there's queen to c6, which hits the rook. Again, there's a lot of pressure here. The queen, the bishop, and the rook are attacking e6. The rook on a4 is under serious pressure, and no matter where you move the rook, let's just say b4, now white can play pawn to d5, and it's just game over. The thing is that if black pushes the pawn here, you go pawn to d6 with this discovered check on the king, and you're going to win the queen on e7. If black doesn't do that, like he moves the king, you can just very quietly take the pawn, and you're simply up one pawn here, and it should be winning in the long run. So instead he goes king g6, and now here Capablanca plays queen to c8. Another very nice move because it protects the bishop from the capture. Additionally, it threatens knight on f8 potentially, but it also again puts pressure on the pawn on e6 here. So queen to b4 is played by Lasker here. Now king f7 is maybe a try to save the pawn. Again, I think this is probably losing. I don't know if it's actually d5. Probably d5 is winning here. I also think like there might be some, I guess bishop b5 doesn't work. Probably yeah, d5, e5, bishop b5, and it's very bad for black because what's going to happen here is, let's say you go rook d4, white can go rook to c1, and the problem is there's full infiltration here. The white king meanwhile is very, very safe. You can go to g2 or h2, whereas the white rook is getting in, the queen is getting in, and it's just all over. You have a king that's way too vulnerable. Instead, queen to b4 is played here by Lasker. Capablanca plays rook to c1. So now queen to e7 played by Lasker. Capablanca plays bishop to d3 check. Again, continuing to improve upon the position here. What you do is this rook on e1, Capablanca realizes it's really nice here, but the way to win the game is to get the rook down and infiltrate on the 7th rank and use the rook and the queen to checkmate the king. So rook c1, queen e7, and now Capablanca plays bishop to d3, and now Lasker makes the final mistake with king h6. He could have played f5 here, but after f5 it's still completely lost with rook c7. If you go queen f6, there's queen e8 check, which collects the rook on a4. If queen d6, you can play, I think, just queen e8, king h6, and queen f7. This also is winning. Again, too many threats. h7 is weak, the knight's weak, queen g7. I mean, there's just nothing that black can really do here to keep the game going. So it's pretty much over anyway, but Lasker very conveniently plays king h6 here, and now rook f7 is played by Capablanca. Lasker plays rook a1 check, the last spite check, king g2, queen to d6, and now Capablanca plays queen takes f8. Really nice finishing touch here, because after queen takes queen, rook takes h7 is simply checkmate. The bishop protects the rook. King has no squares anywhere here. It's just game over, and white wins. So after queen f8, Lasker resigns. This was game 11 of their match. There were, I think, 3 more games played. They were all drawn, and so Capablanca became the world champion. And this was just one of his several victories, but one of the games out of the victories, the one that I like the most. So this is the last game that I'm going to show of Capablanca's, but I think you see a very good understanding of sort of many different themes. You see a great understanding very early on of a position where white understands that having the center is very important. Additionally, later on he understands that he's got a big space advantage, but what do you have to do with that? You need to get your knights in the board here. You can create this outpost on d6. And then even later on, you know, he gets this big positional advantage, but then he understands when to sort of turn it around into something where it becomes a little bit more tactical, and he tries to reroute his pieces to the optimal squares, and and so forth. Again, I don't have a perfect way of explaining that, but it's sort of a transition between like positional, some tactical themes, positional again, and then of course the flurry of tactics at the very end. But this is definitely a model game, especially I think from all facets of it. It's a very model game, especially from this middle game position where you have the bishop and the knight against the two knights, and these weaknesses on e6 and f6. You understand where like the white knight is well placed. You also additionally understand how strong this bishop can become long term on f1, where it can go to like c4 b5. It can also go the other way, and it looks so passive, but the bishop can become very strong very quickly relative to this bad knight on f8.